It's 2 p.m. on a Thursday, and that means I'm recording the Mio on MMA podcast. And obviously, the main event today is going to be talking about UFC 276, which is happening this weekend, and it's a card that I am ever so slightly mixed on. And it's not the quality of the fights that has me mixed. It's that a lot of the fights feel kind of like bizarrely reductive. That instead of being a complex mesh of skills, the fight comes down to like one glaring question to me, anyways. And we'll see if I talk myself into them being more interesting. It's I'm looking forward to the card. It's just that from a analytical breakdown standpoint, I'm not entirely sure I have a ton to say. I feel like my picks are just going to be kind of reductive. There's a lot of news from the MMA world. Sarah Kaufman is retired, and as a big fan of Sarah Kaufman, because Canadian, duh, we're talking about a women's MMA pioneer, a Canadian MMA pioneer, proper Canadian royalty, as was stated by. Let me attribute the quote to the right person, Aaron Brodstetter. And I 100% agree. Actual MMA royalty in Canada has retired. Good luck on whatever it is that is the next adventure for Sarah Kaufman. And I think she'll approach it with aplomb, enthusiasm, and success. Honestly, she just seems like an excellent person. Never met her myself, but interviews, so on. No, I have nothing negative to say about her as a person. And as a fighter, I think she put together a very respectable career given the tools that she had. Which is really the only scale that we can look at. And otherwise, in stupid news, Tyron Woodley has said that he is totally willing to fight Israel Adesanya if the UFC will pay him to fight Israel Adesanya for the belt. I have no idea why this is a story. It shouldn't be. Okay. Moving on, Valerie Loureda also has... I'm not sure if retired is the right word for MMA, because I don't think she's actually used the word retired. She might have. But she's stepping away from MMA to pursue a WWE career. It kind of makes sense. Loureda seemed to have achieved what she was going to achieve in MMA. The interest in her was predominantly from a physical appeal standpoint. I don't think anyone was really thinking she's going to head to great things as a fighter. And as a result, I guess this is a good move. It might lead to more financial well-being for her. She definitely does have a look that the WWE probably will make use of. But I obviously have no idea if she'll take to pro wrestling, because we've seen MMA fighters actually take to pro wrestling. Matt Riddle is the great example of this. And we've seen other MMA fighters take to pro wrestling quite poorly. So, I have no idea where this is going to go. I wish her the best as well. And hopefully she achieves something. And if we step outside of MMA for just like a half second here, just because this fascinates me. So, for those unaware, I'm a big motorsports fan, big Formula One fan, IndyCar, V8 supercars in Australia, GT racing, World Rallycross is something I really wish was way bigger than it is, because it's fantastic, and it's hard to find a place that actually covers it. But anyways, three-time world champion of F1, Nelson Piquet, recently said something, we'll call it controversial, probably racist, motivated against Lewis Hamilton, who is notable for being, number one of the greatest drivers in F1 history, and one of the greatest drivers on the grid right now, being a 7-time world champion, being the all-time leader in podiums and wins and so on. Now, granted, I will always say this. If you look at like the all-time podiums and so on, it tends to be very modern skewed because number one, the cars break down way less now. Like if Jim Clark back in the 60s, number one, hadn't died, but number two, had a car that didn't blow up every second race, his career numbers would be notably higher. So there is that to keep in mind. But Lewis Hamilton has been a dominant force in Formula One for the better part of 2 decades. And he's a black driver, which is pretty much the first of its kind, honestly. F1 is historically been a very European, very white, very money-dominated sport. Naturally, that has led to a certain eugenics pool that tends to be well represented. Lewis bucks that trend to a certain degree. And I'm not going to get into the comments. Like, all I'm going to say is that PK is a Brazilian. He's basically claiming cultural differences to explain what he said. I've asked some Brazilians. I showed people at the gym the comments, the apology, and so on. And they have all said, kind of that's bullshit. Like, no, like even in Brazil, those statements would be construed as racist. And that's the best I can do. And he's come out and basically, made that apology. And now people's defense of him basically boils down to like Max Verstappen, the current F1 championship leader and reigning champion, is dating Nelson Piquet's daughter. And he believes Nelson Piquet is a nice, non-racist person. It's an incredibly terrible defense. Because I'm pretty sure if you find anyone who's accused of being whatever, like being an unkind person in general, you will find people who believe them to be a kind person. That doesn't necessarily guarantee it. And people are like, oh, well, Max knows him better than the people that are like, throwing stones. Does he though? I mean this truthfully. Like there are people who have been family members and so on to people who have done terrible things unobjectionably and think that they were nice people. And like it further is complicated by the fact that Max's father has a, let's put it this way, troubling history of behavior when it comes to his ex-wives, girlfriends, and other people, including cracking the skull of a karting dad back in 1998. Yet Max, I'm sure if asked about Jos, his father, would have nothing but nice things to say. Like, I'm sure that is the case. And he generally has been very praising of his father over his professional spotlight career. All of this is not to say that, Max Verstappen thinking you're a good person is a bad thing. I'm just saying it's not terribly the most, like, absolutely foolproof, ironclad defense. I also had a really weird thing with someone who was trying to claim that it wasn't racist and was kind of trying to put, like, discrimination against redheads and people with glasses. I assume he's a redhead who has glasses on par with, like, using someone's ethnicity as a insult. It's very weird. It's a very weird time to be on F1 Twitter. It's been a very weird time on F1 Twitter for like the last year. But hey, I wanted to dive into that just because it's really confusing me in a way that like also intrigues me. Like I don't understand like the logic pathway to this. But there we go. Back to fighting. Let's talk about fighting. So, ironically, we're going to talk about fighting after talking about people being dicks. PFL is tomorrow. Kayla Harrison's on the card against Caitlin Young. I'll be cheering for Caitlin Young, obviously, but I'm not picking her to win because, to be honest, I'm unlikely to pick anyone to beat Kayla Harrison until she ventures out of the PFL mold. And you know what? I'm going to stop myself there because I don't even think I would pick against her if she ventures out of the PFL mold. Like, it's the unfortunate nature of the thing that a woman of her size has essentially two interesting fights. You can fight Cyborg, or you can fight Amanda Nunes. That's about it, really. Like, those are the only two. And like maybe if like Danielle Wolf or Clarissa Shields like really focuses on the MMA thing and like create something, that would be intriguing. But like, problem is just like at the size, it's incredibly thin. Roy McDonald's on the card, probably going to win. I am looking forward to Ray Cooper the third versus Brett Cooper. Ray Cooper did not look very good in his last fight. I don't mean that like he lost, therefore he didn't look good, because you can look good in a win, or you can look normal in a win, or you can be very impressed with Carlos Leal in the win. But I just mean like kind of physically, he just seemed a little bit off. Like there were signs even in the weigh-ins where I'm like, he doesn't look top notch. So this is a chance for him to rebound against a fighter that is, immutably beatable, but someone who is, an incredible journeyman. Like Brett Cooper. You look up MMA journeyman in the dictionary, Brett Cooper is there. And, so it's an interesting fight while being something he can get back on his feet with. And I don't really think anything else on the card is that interesting. Oh, no. I'm going to take that back. Vanessa Mello versus Elena Kolesnik. That's interesting. Like, there are two girls that, like, one has a 6-4 record, one has an 11-9 record. So, it doesn't look great. But ignore the records for a second. It's actually pretty interesting. Now, to be clear, they're in the 155-pound tournament. Neither of them should be fighting there. They're tiny compared to Kayla Harrison. But it's an interesting fight. It's a fight that I'm actually looking forward to. I think Kolesnik probably going to win. But like that is one that I'm actually very interested in seeing fight. Now, mind you, Harrison was supposed to fight Julia Budd. That's interesting a little bit, but not really. Like I said, it's really a Cyborg or Nunez thing. And then you have Rizin 36, where the fight I was really looking forward to, Kai Asakura versus Jiyong Yang, has been pulled off because Asakura has been injured. I don't really have a fight to recommend for you guys on that. I think it'll be good. Like it's definitely one of those fights that like, or cards that like for JMMA fans, Japanese MMA fans, definitely worth looking at. Definitely, and not a bad jump off point if you're not, but there's no big you must see this fight on the Rizin card. So if you got time, check it out. Rizin is fun. Rizin's production values are excellent. Their cards never cease to fail to deliver intrigue and so on, even if like the highest end talent is not, necessarily in play. It's still very interesting. Let's get on to UFC 276. This is what you're here for. This is what you're interested for. We open up with the main event that to me should not be the main event. And this is no disrespect to Izzy Adesanya or Jared Cannonier. Both are fantastic fighters. Both are absolutely at the top of their game. And I think Izzy Adesanya deserves a lot of talk on the pound for pound charts because he's an amazing fighter. I think people overlook him. They bring up the Jan loss a lot, I find. And they talk about the sort of dullness of some of the other fights when, it takes two to tango to a certain degree. But the fight itself is not super intriguing, and also the co-main event, Volkanovski versus Holloway, really, really should be the main event. Like, we're talking about a trilogy that is 2-0 in favor of Volkanovski, but people are still actually really, really interested in it. That's the hallmark of an amazing rivalry, and that isn't generated by like any kind of false heat or anything. Like, these two guys respect each other. Like, this is an athletic competition and not something like a Chuck Tito or a Tito Shamrock type of thing where like we're interested in it, but we're interested in it for like out of cage reasons more so than in cage reasons. So that is phenomenal. That's honestly phenomenal. That should be the main event. But we'll talk about them how they're actually on the card. Adesanya Cannonier. A lot of people have been comparing this fight to Adesanya's fight with Paulo Costa, and I definitely get it. Cannonier fits into a similar kind of very dangerous, hard hitting physicality over necessarily the smoothest technique or the smoothest game planning, and to a degree, somewhat predictable because both of them really kind of want to do the same things regardless of opponent. Now, I do think Cannonier is actually a more challenging opponent than Paulo Costa. It's kind of weird because I think if the two of them fought, I would probably take Costa, assuming that I trust him to actually have his shit together, which after that Marvin Vettori fight, I don't. But let's say alternate universe in like a year's time, Costa's proven to have his stuff, together, and he gets booked against Cannonier, I would probably lean towards Costa. But Cannonier against Izzy is a more interesting matchup because I think Cannonier, even though I did just talk about how his game is more tied to the physicality of himself than it is to great technical depth or game planning, I think is actually a pretty competent game planner. I think that he tries to find gaps and weaknesses in the opponent that he could make use of, whereas like Paulo Costa, it's like square peg, round hole. I'm going to get it in there just by pure force of will whenever he fights. Like there's nothing about Paulo Costa that ever speaks to like high fight IQ. It's just high physicality and confidence, frankly, backed by immeasurable confidence. And with Cannonier, I think that there is a little bit more fight IQ in the mix. Now, that being said, trying to talk up Cannonier here for a second, I don't really see how he wins this fight. Now, to be clear, he has the power and the explosiveness and the lethality that him knocking out Israel Adesanya in a flash KO, Matt Serra GSP way, or in a manner similar to honestly like how Israel Adesanya got knocked out by Alex Pereira a little bit, or something like trying to think of like a more MMA based like one that kind of works here. Maybe like Dricus du Plessis, who we'll talk about later on, knocking out Trevin Giles while looking not the greatest in the fight. Definitely is on the table. Like it's not that I can't in my head envision how Cannonier wins this fight. It's that from a minute to minute to winning the fight in a scoring sense, in a repetitive success sense, I don't really know how he does it. Because he doesn't really have a wrestling game to speak of. It's not something that is high level or really meshed into his striking all that well. So if you're going to go out there and just strike with Izzy, just kickbox with Izzy, Izzy is I want to say a notably longer fighter. Let me just make sure of that. It's only 2.5 inches. Okay, so but 2.5 inches to a guy like Izzy with the educated, footwork and range keeping tools that he has, it's a lot. And Cannonier's a little predictable. He doesn't have a lot of different ways to implement his game. And I think that Eugene Behrman, guys at City Kickboxing, have a lot of respect for their ability to game plan, for their ability to break someone down. And then I also have a lot of respect for Izzy's physicality, technique, and ability to make adjustments in a fight. I think actually, to be honest, I think that's probably the thing that in Izzy's case, is incredibly overlooked. I don't see where Cannonier starts to get a lot of success rolling. And that kind of leaves my pick to being like, do I think Izzy knocks him out, or do I think Izzy just wins a decision? And like, Cannonier's never been knocked out at middleweight. He has been knocked out at heavyweight, Sean Jordan. He has been knocked out at 205, Dominic Reyes, both of whom are, I would say, bigger hitters, because they're big hitters for their own division, than Izzy Adesanya. But Izzy is also a far, far better striker. And that's no disrespect to Sean Jordan and Dominic Reyes, who I think actually have pretty well put together games, considering they, at the time of their fights, they've been striking far less portions of their lives and time than Izzy Adesanya. So do I think it goes the distance, or do I think it's a finish? I'm going to predict a finish. I think that Izzy is feeling a little bit of pressure to have a finish here. Just a little bit. Because, the Whitaker fight was one that rightly or wrongfully has been kind of critiqued as a problem. But, I don't think Cannonier can replicate that game plan. He doesn't have the wrestling, and he doesn't have the depth that Whitaker does. I mean, they fought each other, and it kind of showed. Cannonier's physical attributes, giving him big moments, but not a lot of routine, minute-by-minute success. I think Izzy will keep the range fairly well. I think he'll avoid the power striking in the pocket of Cannonier for the most part. I believe he will get hit at some point. I do believe Cannonier at some point will wade into the pocket, will catch him. But I think that Izzy's chin is quite good. And I think that as long as Izzy sees it coming, there's not a tremendous puncher's chance. So let's say like a third round KO for Izzy. But yeah, it's going to be a really interesting fight to watch. It's just that from an analytical standpoint, I don't have a ton to say. And it's going to be the same thing with Holloway and Volkanovski. So let's transition into our other title fight. And this one doesn't have a lot to say because we've seen 10 rounds of this, and 10 rounds kind of recently. It's not like this has been years in the making or anything. This has been, when did they first fight each other? I want to say it's been 2 years. Less than about 2.5. About 2.5. I'm a little bit off. They fought first in December of 2019. They fought in July of 2020. So there's been some time, but there's not been a lot of footage. The Brian Ortega and Chan Sung Jung fights for Volkanovski were kind of very one-sided. I don't think we saw anything tremendously metamorphosizable about it. And then kind of the same with the Cater and Yair Rodriguez fights for Holloway. There's been time. There's been 2 years to change the rhythm of this fight, but I'd be lying if I said I knew how it was going to be changed. I have no doubt that we'll see a different fight than we saw in the first two. That Holloway will have some new tricks. That Volkanovski will have some new tricks. But I don't know what they would be. And as much as I can totally picture Holloway winning this fight, the gap between the two in their first two fights, incredibly thin. And that means that Holloway has more room to improve and to fix what went wrong than Volkanovski does. But I'm kind of stuck picking Volkanovski by decision because we have seen it happen twice. We have seen Volkanovski go out there and solve the Holloway equation over 10 rounds. So it's up to Holloway to show us that he can solve the Volkanovski equation, which we haven't really seen. He's obviously the longer fighter. He's got an amazing gas tank, can put up amazing, attritive, striking performances. But Volkanovski is, for an MMA fighter, and a guy who isn't from necessarily a striking background, is amazing defensively and amazing at breaking down the tendencies and finding little openings in his opponent's style to land quality shots. It's legitimately amazing. And I'm in awe of the fight, but like, in case in point, I was going to spend a lot less time talking about it than Adesanya versus Cannonier, which is a fight where I'm confidently picking Adesanya. Volkanovski by decision because we have, in fact, seen it happen before. But I hope to see something new and interesting from both guys. Sean Strickland versus Alex Pereira, who was mentioned a little bit earlier. This fight comes down to me, kind of like one thing, and like this is like the king of reductive fights, is that it's not that it's not interesting, it's not that it's not fascinating, and it's not that it won't be a good fight. But this fight to me comes down to, does Sean Strickland, how much of Sean Strickland's act is completely immutable in the cage? What I mean by that is Sean Strickland's act is that he's a psychopath. And I think to a certain degree, like, there is truth in it. But, like, part of that is that he's like, no, like, impulse control is not really a thing for me. I would be the guy destroying people in prison. I would be, and all of these do not actually seem to fit his fighting style. I talked about this on the weekend about Danny Sabatello, a guy who talks a violent game and delivers very little in the cage. Strickland is very much the same, in the sense that a guy who talks like he talks should not be a fight behind a jab volume striker. Like, there's nothing wrong with how he fights. It's winning him fights. But if you were legitimately in the mental state that you claim to be in, I don't think it would be the case. And we've seen Sean Strickland wrestle before. We've seen Sean Strickland grapple before. Someone on Twitter suggested that, like, because Sean Strickland did not grapple Jack Marshman, means that he will not grapple Alex Pereira. I think that's ridiculous. I think if you look back at the Strickland-Marshman fight, at no point was he uncomfortable or felt like he was in trouble on the feet. So why would he grapple? Don't get me wrong, like, pathway to victory against Marshman, hell of a lot easier through grappling. But if you're going to go out there and you're going to fight a guy who has less reach than you, doesn't have great range-finding tools, doesn't have great gap-closing tools, is really only dangerous in a pocket sort of brawl, giving you a lot of, like, areas to be quote-unquote safe in the fight, then, you know, your view that stand-up fighting is way better is going to lead to that. But, like, Pereira is a guy who should be able to deal with the reach. What is the reach disadvantage here? Actually, out of curiosity. Strickland supposedly only has a 76-inch reach, which I don't honestly believe is the case. This might be one of those cases where, like, fingertip to fingertip reach is kind of misleading versus, like, the armpit to fingertip, which is kind of like the actual punching range, to a certain degree. So, yeah, Pereira is 6'4". This really does come down to, like, because, like, presumably Pereira at 6'4", and I didn't realize actually for a second that he is 6'4". I knew he was tall, but, like, I didn't realize that he was 3 inches taller than Strickland. Mind you, I do think Strickland's more than 6'1". This is one of those cases where, like, his listed height has always been 6'1". I don't really believe it. You would think that he has the reach, the technical capacity, and the athletic skills to get inside Strickland's comfort zone, to make this a pocket fighting fight as opposed to an outside jabbing fight for Strickland. And the question is, does Strickland just take him down and like utilize his actually really good grappling? And to be clear, Strickland is not Andreas Michailidis, for example, who people made a big deal out of his black belt when he grappled with him with Pereira for some reason. And I want to get the exact numbers here before I UFC stats, please. Which was that Bruno Silva only attempted 2 takedowns. I'm right on that. Oh, no. He's 2 of 8. Pardon me. He did have some takedowns, but they were not very long. And Bruno Silva, I think, also kind of tired himself out. Trying to Billy Big Balls Pereira, if we're being completely honest. Like, Strickland has the easy way out here. He can just take this fight down. Just implement his wrestling game and his grappling game and get the job done. It's just, do we believe that his want to play a character and pride allows him to do it? You know what? Okay. I usually don't make emotional picks. Usually don't. But in this case, I'm going to make an exception. Because I'm annoyed by the fact that I'm reliant on Strickland fighting smart and not being a psychopath and not giving into his ego, not giving into the character. That if he does do that and he wins, I'm actually just going to be annoyed. So here we go. I'm going to sadness hedge. Essentially, I'm going to pick Pereira because if he wins, I like the future elements it brings because it brings a possible fight with Izzy Adesanya for the belt. And I think that would be fantastic. And I think it will see some signs of him developing as a fighter, particularly if he defends maybe a couple of takedowns. Whereas if Strickland wins, it leads to a pretty uninteresting title shot or no title shot if the UFC doesn't give him one. And I will probably have to listen to him be a freaking psychopath with even more ego and annoying the crap out of me. He is like my least liked fighter in the UFC right now. So, I'm picking Pereira to knock him out. There's very little conviction to it. There's an obvious game plan, obvious path to victory for Strickland. I'm just going to say he doesn't do it. And this way, if Pereira wins, I'm just really, really happy. Because if Strickland wins, even if I pick him, I'm still not going to be happy. So there you go. The rare, like, super emotional pick that is based more on what won't drive me insane than anything else. Robbie Lawler, Brian Barberena. This is a super awesome fight. I'm picking Lawler to win. Lawler is just essentially not as done as Matt Brown is, and to be clear, at their primes, Robbie Lawler was a much better fighter than Matt Brown. I am a massive fan of Matt Brown, but comparing him and Robbie Lawler at their peaks, Lawler was the better fighter. I think Lawler's the better fighter now. I think that Lawler, as long as he, and I hate to say like things like unmotivated or uninterested, because it's come up with like Gegard Mousasi losing to Johnny Edblum, of course, with like people being like, oh, we're going to justify Gegard losing this fight by his lack of interest. But like, no, there is, Robbie Lawler is this rare example of like a guy who is perfectly capable of still winning fights is perfectly capable of fighting off takedowns, keeping it on the feet, letting his hands go, still looking good when he's throwing combinations, still having a pretty ability to keep a pretty high pace and getting the job done. But if you just wrestle him enough, he does legitimately look like he's just not interested anymore, and you've actually kind of bored him into a loss. I don't think Barberena will do that. Barberena didn't even really particularly try to put Matt Brown on his back. Let's get the numbers, actually. Because we know I like the numbers. I'm a stats guy. They don't tell us the sign of a fight. Don't get me wrong. Looking at a box score in MMA is not remotely something to think about. But did not attempt a takedown against Matt Brown. According to the stats. And anything that he did, anything that you recall maybe being a takedown that wasn't caught by the stats. Because I do recall one in the third round. Not a takedown per se, but an attempt. Came off of grappling exchanges instigated by Brown. So he's going to stand and bang with Lawler. In all likelihood. He's viewing this as his final run, and he's kind of just interested in having super cool, awesome fights. Which means he'll probably give Robbie Lawler the exact fight that he wants and can absolutely still win. So Robbie Lawler, I kind of feel like it's probably going to be a finish. Because Barberena has looked susceptible to finishes in recent times. Didn't get finished by Jason Witt, but got hurt a lot. Got finished by Randy Brown. Not necessarily going to be that kind of same thing. But the Vicente Luque fight probably looks a little like what I'm expecting here. So, yeah, I'm taking Robbie Lawler. Pedro Munoz versus Sean O'Malley. Talk about guys who I don't really like. Sean O'Malley is kind of on that list. But here's the thing. I don't hate Sean O'Malley as a fighter. I actually don't even really hate what Sean O'Malley's doing. I find myself completely unmoved by the Sean O'Malley character. Much in the same way that I found myself completely unmoved by the Conor McGregor character. My dislike is more rooted in so what exactly is it that you guys love about this guy? And don't get me wrong, he's a fairly exciting fighter. There's a lot of potential there, but in the sense that he is being treated as this generational talent, this super, super special thing, both by the fans and by the UFC to a certain degree, because he's been getting kind of the Conor McGregor matchmaker. And again, I've said this, I actually don't really have a problem with the whole, quote, easy matchmaking that a fighter gets. I think that's how you build stars. That's how you build creatures like Sean O'Malley. I actually don't really have a problem with it. But let's not act like he's So again, someone on Twitter, and this is a view I've seen put in by a few, but this was just a conversation that was had. Someone put forth the idea that okay, Chito Vera is pretty elite, which is a little bit questionable because Chito Vera has some definitive shortcomings, but I'm a big fan of Chito Vera, so fair enough. Chito Vera is pretty high up in the food chain, and everyone else O'Malley's beaten pretty easily. So that means that Sean O'Malley is elite or just below elite. It kind of ignores that there's been virtually no actual middle ground for Sean O'Malley, virtually none. His best win is Raulian Paiva. Paiva's a guy whose success is predominantly at flyweight, not bantamweight. He's a guy who usually feels insulated by his reach, and that wasn't going to be the case with O'Malley. So really good stylistic matchup. And then his other wins are Thomas Almeida and Eddie Wineland, who are just absolutely kind of done. Chris Matinho, who, let's be honest, probably should never have been in the UFC. Quinones, Ware, and Sukuta were all kind of this, interesting enough, debuting fighter or, first couple of fights. guys, like there's not a lot of a middle ground here. Now, that being said, like there's an obvious path to victory here against Pedro Munoz, and that is that Sean O'Malley is much taller, much longer. He is 5 inches taller. He has a 7-inch reach advantage over Pedro Munoz. Munoz has not seemed overly interested in trying to enforce a grappling game on anyone in a while. He's a bit foot slow. His defense is kind of relying on the fact that he can just take a boatload of punishment and keep going. And that like doesn't really seem like a great recipe for beating O'Malley. Not really. Honestly, O'Malley can stay to the outside, utilize superior foot speed, not necessarily even superior footwork, but like just purely being faster on his feet to probably deliver a lot of offense from the outside, and Munoz is going to be kind of like following him around the cage a fair bit. Now, Munoz is super tough. If he can implement a grappling game, probably is the better grappler. And of course, there is the concern with O'Malley because he hurt his leg against Chito Vera and he hurt his leg against Sukumta, that there is a potentially option to just chronically kick the crap out of his legs and hurt him that way. And Munoz is a dangerous leg kicker. But I'm going to work on the idea that O'Malley's legs are just not completely glass, that he'll be able to implement his reach advantage, again, of 7 inches, that he'll be able to utilize what is actually a very good outside striking game and pick up the win here by decision. I don't think he finishes Munoz because maybe I'm reading too much into the Matinho fight, but like the number of times he hit Chris Matinho and then to see Matinho just get melted, to me suggests that he kind of doesn't have the greatest power in the world. And that, like, if you look at a lot of his KOs, they tend to be of the variety of someone kind of driving themselves right into his power. And while Munoz will do that, Munoz does have a incredibly rock hard chin and does seem to see everything coming. Like, that's the thing, is like he'll power his way into your power, but like he's completely aware that that's what he's doing. And he's ready for the big shot. He's braced. He's ready to receive the violence you are going to put upon him. And that's why I think he will probably make it to decision. But I don't find myself terribly convinced that he's going to be able to win the fight. And if here's the thing with O'Malley. I in no way believe O'Malley is like a can crusher or someone who's not talented. It's just that if he wins off of this by a 5-round decision, I better not hear shot calls for him to get a title shot or that he's deeply invigorated within the top 5 or anything. Because like, slow the roll. This is kind of like I know that like Munoz is ranked fairly high, and rightfully so, but like he is on a losing skid, 2-fight losing skid. The win over Jimmy Rivera doesn't look as amazing because Rivera just got cut. So like he's 1-4 in his last 5. Like this should probably really just get O'Malley like a 11 or 12, maybe 10th ranking in the UFC. If your thoughts are that this leads to anything beyond that I would question. I would legitimately question that at that point. And then the only win I think was over Garbrandt. Yeah. So that's that fight. Looking forward to it. Super interesting fight. Super intriguing. And I don't have to sadness hedge like I do with the Sean Strickland fight because like in the cage, don't really have a problem with O'Malley. And I don't have like a disconnect of like his personality versus his in the cage. No. His personality very much suits how he fights. And it's for the large part processionally based and like analytically sound. Moving on down Brad Riddell versus Jalen Turner. I believe this is the feature prelim. Yes, it is. Obviously the big question here is you got a 6'3" fighter versus a 5'7" fighter. You've got a apparently only like 4-inch reach advantage for Turner. I suspect it's probably more than that. Turner's looked very, very good lately. Very athletic, very powerful, very lethal, both on the feet and on the ground. So there's obviously a ton going for him here. On paper, looks very, very good. But I am going to take Brad Riddell to win a decision. Now, okay, so the reason here is twofold to a certain degree. One is that I think Riddell can deal with reach. Like, this is a guy who does train with Dan Hooker on a regular basis. He is a guy who has, at least in kickboxing, faced fairly elite, longer fighters and been able to find solutions. That, like, he has the technical acumen, the footwork, and so on to actually get inside and make the reach less of a thing. And the flip side of that coin is also that it does feel like Turner is more insulated by his reach than making it an active defensive idea. Now, what do I mean by that is, on one end of a scale, let's picture a scale in your head. On one end of a scale is Stefan Struve. This guy who is like 7 feet tall and like has a massive reach. I think he does actually legitimately have like the longest reach anyone's ever had in the UFC. But it's completely useless because he doesn't have the footwork, the striking acumen, he doesn't have the game to implement it. You have to walk through certain things, but you can do that fairly easily as long as you don't get knocked out and force a game onto him, even though he has such a reach advantage. And then, like, on the opposite of the spectrum, kind of is Sean Strickland, like kind of a guy or Izzy Adesanya, whose reach is actually part of their defense, and they've developed a game around maintaining that reach and establishing that outside game. Sean O'Malley actually kind of like that as well. Jalen Turner is kind of in the middle, where like there is some of that technical aspect to maintaining his reach. There is some semblance of footwork. There is some ability to fight off the back foot. There is some ability to establish a range striking game. But a lot of like what he really, really likes to do is kind of be forward moving. He likes to fight in a way that doesn't necessarily emphasize his reach. And you combine that with Riddle's technical acumen, like I said, I think Riddle will be able to put him into the type of fight that he wants. And Riddle's actually a pretty good wrestler. Pretty good at shutting down other people's wrestling and actually reasonably good at getting his own takedowns. So while Turner is probably, as his nickname would suggest, the Tarantula, super deadly. I can think of a number of ways he wins this fight. By knockout, by submission. But I think if he does not get that moment of lethality, that moment to finish this, I just see Riddell slowly but surely taking him apart in a kickboxing match. Because he's a high-level kickboxer, and Turner isn't. That being said, Turner does train with Jason Perillo. I'm incredibly excited about him long-term. I'm actually kind of disappointed that they made this fight because Riddle's coming off that loss to Rafael Fiziev. And then Turner still hasn't quite established himself as like someone who can take a big loss and keep on getting good fights. It's like I'm a little dissatisfied with the timing of this fight. I think it's one that I think the loser of this fight will probably pay a little bit more of a price than is fair. There's also watching the Turner versus Frivola fight was like an interesting example of that, where like Frivola, who is a way less adept at closing the gap than Riddle is, although I do believe he's taller. He's 5'9", so he's a little taller, but similar reach. Was able to get inside and do things with Turner, and that wasn't that long ago. So yeah, I am taking Riddle by decision. Donald Cerrone, Jim Miller, 2. Not going to beat around the bush much. I don't honestly believe that Cerrone has a lot left in the tank. Is kind of what it comes down to. Guy has not won a fight since 2019 against Ally Quinta. He's lost to, again, tremendously great fighters in that time period. Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje, Conor McGregor, Anthony Pettis. The no contest with Nico Price. And the loss to Alex Morono. He just doesn't really have any of the things that traditionally are a problem for Jim Miller right now. Like, obviously, he won the first fight. So, obviously, you can use that as a blueprint to victory. But Miller, he has a hard time maintaining range nowadays. He has a hard time. He's always been a slow starter. Miller's a fast starter. Miller certainly is not at his peak either. Like, obviously not. He's in his late 30s, I do believe. What is his age? 38 years old. Yeah, not much younger. But has a style that I think inherently always was going to age a little bit better. He has, we've seen this repetitively. Like, who are the guys that go super, super long into their careers? It's guys who are predominantly going to grapple. They're going to make it a clinchy fight. They're going to be grindy. Randy Couture, Demian Maia, Jim Miller is another example. There's not a lot of 39-year-old kickboxers. And Donald Cerrone is far more than just kickboxer. He's a guy who can wrestle. He's a guy who can grapple. Guy did actually just recently beat RDA in a grappling match. That's pretty damn impressive. But I do honestly see Miller probably finishing in the first round. We'll see. We'll see if he goes out on a high note, but it's always kind of weird with a retirement fight. He's also taking this on short notice. This was supposed to be Jim Miller versus Bobby Green. So Miller's had a full camp. I know Cerrone's been training for Joe Lozon. And Joe Lozon is admittedly actually a very, a reasonably similar port in terms of how they match up to Jim Miller. Certainly more so than I would say Cerrone is of Bobby Green. But I don't know. I trust Miller is not done yet. Although it's probably very close. And Cerrone just is very done. It's kind of it's not indifferent to the fact that at no point prior to this point would I have been pondering taking Joe Lozon against Donald Cerrone. Yet I was pondering it. Ian Gary versus Gabe Green, another guy that they're kind of treating like Sean O'Malley in the sense that Ian Gary in a stacked welterweight division has ended up fighting Darian Weeks, Jordan Williams in the first two fights. I thought he had a third fight in there. Yeah, he's not. Okay, so I'm a little less angry about that then. Now he's getting Gabe Green. I am picking him to win here. I'm incredibly unimpressed with Ian Gary. Full stop. I find the blatant Conor McGregor attempt to be Conor McGregor. And that's it. It's not people. There are Gary fans that are trying to suggest that he's not trying to be Conor McGregor. He's trying to be his own man. No. This guy is literally aping the mannerisms of Conor McGregor. And he doesn't have Conor McGregor's charisma. So I don't know. And his fights have been kind of uninspiring. He had a lot more problems with Williams and Weeks than I really think he should have. And Gabe Green is better than those two guys. He's a much more creative striker. Since getting his eyes fixed, he seems to actually have found a lot more range. But he is a guy that had some really, really struggling moments with Johan Linus. I do think Gary has all the physical tools, trains out of a good gym at Sanford MMA, should be getting better every time out, although I didn't see as much improvement between Williams and Weeks that I was really kind of counting on and banking on. But I'm assuming that he's done a good job of studying his opponent. I'm assuming he's ready for the tricks that Green brings. And I'm assuming that having a 5-inch height advantage actually means that he has more than a 1-inch reach advantage, because apparently it's 74 to 73. And again, I don't think that that's probably correct. Gary, decision. I still don't know what to make of the kid. Like, obviously, he hasn't lost yet. There is that. He is super young, has a lot of time to figure it out. But it does feel like a little bit like he kind of thinks he's figured it out already. And I don't think he has. He's really scraped the bottom of the welterweight barrel and not come up looking great. Brad Tavares versus Dricus du Plessis, who I mentioned earlier. Part of me really wants Dricus to win this fight. He's a young, up-and-coming fighter. There's always this certain appeal to that. Tavares has been around forever. He very much is what he is. Like, Tavares is not going to do anything that surprises me in this fight. Tavares is not going to make a sudden technical development that I wasn't expecting. He's just going to be Brad Tavares. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a little boring. It's a little boring. And I don't even mean like he's a boring fighter. I just mean like we know exactly what he's going to get, whereas du Plessis represents like this kind of fresh air, sort of creative guy who has undeniably some interesting power stopping. But like at the same time, you look at his fights with Marcus Perez and with Trevin Giles, two really grab bag fighters with tremendous gaps in their game, and fights that at various points he was losing. And you think to yourself, Brad Tavares might be kind of dull, kind of boring, but he's an incredibly well put together MMA fighter with a defensively responsible striking style that is designed to, admittedly, mostly win decisions, but be pretty difficult to be finished by. Edmund Shabazian did finish him, so there is that sort of port. And there are certain similarities between du Plessis, and Shabazian, and also finished by Robert Whitaker, finished by Tim Boach back in the day. So like, it can be done. It absolutely can be done. But he's also been in there with some big hitters, picked up the wins. Hey, Mark Wart, Lorenz Larkin, recently Omari Akhmedov, who's really proven to actually be kind of a force at 205. And yeah, I'm picking Tavares to win a very Brad Tavares fight, to be a more well put together and functionally sound fighter than, say, Trevin Giles is. Because like, a lot of what allowed du Plessis to win that fight against Trevin Giles was Trevin Giles' tendency to leave himself wide freaking open to getting absolutely clubbed. Tavares doesn't have that. Yes, du Plessis does have uncanny power, but I think we're in for a Brad Tavares fight. Uriah Hall versus Andre Muniz. I think people are a little too confident on Muniz. Like, he's at minus 300 here. I haven't been talking about the odds because the odds haven't been terribly interesting, but this fight is the first time I think they're really interesting. Minus 300 Muniz, plus 240 for Uriah Hall. I'm picking Muniz, so obviously I'm okay with him being the favorite. But I think like this fight resembles Uriah Hall versus Shoeface quite a bit, in the sense that you have a wrestler or a grappler who doesn't necessarily have the greatest takedown game going up against Hall, who's long, rangy, athletic, still really isn't necessarily a guy who grappling has been really a pathway to success against. And he's going to have some definite moments. I just think that also at the same time, Muniz is a little more comfortable as a fighter than Shoeface is. Like, he realizes what he is and also is a lot more aggressive on the ground. I think that could possibly tire out Hall. And lead to a submission victory for Muniz. But minus 300, that does feel like is he the biggest favorite that I've talked about so far? Kind of want to think that he maybe is. Let's talk about the odds real quick on everything up leading up to this point. Just because I honestly kind of forgot to do that. So let's talk about it real quick. Is Hall the biggest favorite or the biggest underdog? No, Adesanya is a bigger favorite, minus 540 to plus 325 for Cannonier. Holloway's plus 155 to minus 190 for Volkanovski. Strickland's plus 100 against minus 120 for Alex Pereira. Kind of surprised by that. I don't. I'm picking Pereira, but like I don't think anyone should really have that kind of confidence to make him a favorite there. Robbie Lawler is surprisingly only a minus 125 to plus 105 for Barberena. O'Malley's minus 300 to plus 240 for Munoz. That's a little too wide. Brad Riddell's plus 115 to minus 140 for Jalen Turner. Plus 170 to minus 200. That's Cerrone to Miller. Ian Gary's minus 175 to plus 150 for Gabe Green. Tavares is the underdog. Plus 115 to minus 140. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. That feels much too wide to be one of the wider fights on the card. And like I could definitely see Hall winning via spectacular knockout because like Muniz is there for that. He is open to getting hit and get hit really hard. Or even just like a decision win. I don't know. Like that feels way too wide. Jessica Eye versus Macy Barber. I am hoping that the minus 270 favorite, Macy Barber, gets plus 250 Jessica Eye, comes out on top. This is a fight I did call for. Like it's a big, interesting fight because Barber's whole game is kind of like a bully physicality game. And I want to see if there's any nuance to it, if there's any adaptability, if there's any hustle, if there's any gumption, grit, all of these words that can lead to her actually being someone who can be something. Or is she just an athlete who's going to fold whenever she just doesn't blow people out of the water? Because it's kind of been her career to do that. When she just didn't immediately murder Modafferi and Grasso, she lost. She should have lost to Miranda Maverick in a fight where she kept running into the same wall over and over and over again. And yes, she did beat Montella De La Rosa, but Montella De La Rosa is a notably physically limited fighter, like a notable non-athlete in that division, who gets by on hard work and like reasonable technical aplomb. And got that one like with high. It's all right. Here is sort of the older version of yourself, someone who's very physical, someone who's very bullyish, probably has a better boxing game, but a worse otherwise game. Probably isn't quite the grappler Barber is. Probably isn't quite the wrestler Barber is. Probably isn't the kicker Barber is. Can Barber go out there and like get the job done? And I think of the three pathways I see is like, if I wins, it's because Barber kind of just self-destructs. If Barber wins, it's either because she proves to be just kind of a physical upgrade on Jessica Eye and kind of just grinds, makes a dirty fight work, or she shows some actual like innovation to her game, some problem solving, some fight IQ, some creativity. I'm really hoping for that one because I come off as a Barber hater to a certain degree, talking about how I really don't like how her dad is, the role her dad plays in her career. And it's not that like I'm against dads being involved in their kids' MMA career, but like her dad seems like just a knucklehead, honestly. Like the whole after saga of the Roxanne Modafferi fight and just the kind of insistence of youngest champion ever. Yeah. And I really don't think she's at the right gym. But I don't know. Hopefully she wins this fight. Hopefully she gets it done because my lord, does Jessica Eye win probably look incredibly awkward and terrible. And then finally, we have Jessica Rose Clark versus Juliana Stoliarenko, minus 165 for Clark, 1+135 for Stoliarenko. If this fight had been booked at like any other point, I'd have really no compunctions about picking Jessica Rose Clark to win this fight. But at the same time, it feels incredibly like the Stephanie Edgar fight in the sense that the pathways to win, and I do mean pathways, plural, for Clark to win this fight are very well defined. But it was with Edgar as well. She went out there, she went right into the jaws of the beast, and she got armbarred. And she's now up against someone who is good at arm bars, but doesn't necessarily really have a game that leads to it because she doesn't have a particularly great takedown game. She doesn't have a particularly great game that really leads to anything. Like how many times has she won by armbar? One, including custom rule bouts, I must say. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 wins by armbar. My lord. It's kind of Ronda Rousey-esque, but like without the like massive physicality that Ronda brought to the table. I have to pick Jessica Rose Clark because I have to have confidence that she's not going to make the exact same mistake again. That she's going to go out there and realize that she has a pocket striking advantage. She has a advantage at range. She has an advantage in the clinch as long as she doesn't get flying armbarred. That if she just kind of maintains like a standing clinch and works a striker's clinch, she can probably just honestly dominate Stoliarenko. Because Stoliarenko just is not very good. Full stop. Just really isn't. But my lord, does that Stephanie Edgar fight just absolutely haunt my brain when making that pick. So, enjoy the fights. As per usual, check out the Discord where we are doing mixed martial arts simulated action where you can make a fighter and kind of guide yourself through like basically a career mode of sorts. You can chat MMA with like other people who listen to the podcast. You can also check out the Slam Ball sim, which is fun. It's basketball, but like with trampolines and physicality and all that fun. And the pro wrestling sim, as well as checking out, some of the stuff I put up on Twitch, on YouTube, so on. Hope you enjoy that. Hope you take some time to check that out. And of course, follow me on Twitter. And, wherever you are, like and subscribe, so on. Like, the things like on YouTube, on Spotify, on Acast, on Anchor, wherever you're watching this, do what you can to support the podcast and help it grow and bring up a bigger audience. So, I'm very much relying on word of mouth. Do me a solid if you enjoy the show. And have a great day. Enjoy the fights. And actually going to be a really good weekend for me because I'm going to the CFL game in Hamilton tomorrow, so that's going to be fun. And, well, I say this, and then I realize that the Hamilton Tiger Cats are 0-3 and have been kind of hopeless. But hey, go in with low expectations. Can't really be disappointed. So have a great day. Enjoy the fights. And I'll talk to you on the other side.